The case we'll be discussing today has practically marked an era in Argentina. Several films and a television series have been made based on this crime story, several books have been written, and hundreds of journalistic works have been published. The main protagonists of this crime story are the members of the so-called Puccio family and their few accomplices. At the head of the organized criminal organization was Arquimedes, the head of the family. Arquimedes Rafael Puccio was born on September 14, 1929, in General Puccio, a town in the northeastern province of La Pampa in Argentina. He was the eldest of 6 children. He graduated with a degree in economics, specializing in accounting. He then served as vice consul in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at a young age served on various diplomatic missions in Europe. Later, in 1973, he enrolled at the School of Political Administration and, despite knowing virtually nothing about sports, became Deputy Minister of Sports for the city of Buenos Aires. Among other things, Arquimedes is said to have belonged to a so-called intelligence battalion called the 601. This battalion became particularly well known during the Dirty War, and according to available information, its members were involved in the kidnapping and murder of hundreds of people. Arquimedes was also a member of an anti-communist alliance and active in the nationalist movement. Most people, however, knew him as a quiet, polite, and inconspicuous man who could often be seen peacefully sweeping the sidewalk in front of his house. His neighbors even considered this activity a kind of obsession for him. Perhaps it was also a way to make sure everything was in order and that no one was watching his house. Arquimedes married Epifania Angelis Calbu, a professor of accounting and mathematics, on October 5, 1957. Alejandro was born in Buenos Aires in 1958 and was the couple's first child. Sylvia was born 2 years later and Daniel a year later. Later in 1963, Guillermo was born. Their youngest daughter, Adriana, was born 7 years later. During this time, the couple bought a 2-story house in the affluent suburb of San Isidro near Buenos Aires. The ground floor housed their family business, where they sold water sports and fishing equipment. The family also owned a small bar in a neighboring building, where the family patriarch usually held meetings with his accomplices and discussed the details of future kidnappings. Their meetings looked like a group of friends gathered to discuss the country's politics or the result of the latest soccer match. But in reality, everything was quite different. Arquimedes' right-hand man was his eldest son, Alejandro, who was also a fairly well-known professional rugby player for the local club, Atlético San Isidro. It should be noted that Arquimedes' other son, Guillermo, was not involved in the family's criminal activities, having moved to Australia some time before the events described. The most important events related to this case occurred almost immediately after the end of the so-called Falklands War, which ended in June 1982. The situation in Argentina was extremely tense and unstable. Due to various circumstances, Arquimedes had become unemployed, which meant that he was faced with the problem of supporting his family. It was at this point that he decided to engage in criminal activities, more specifically kidnapping wealthy people for ransom. With the support of his family, the man met with old acquaintances and explained the outlines of his plan. Arquimedes' first accomplice was Rodolfo Franco, a 76-year-old retired colonel who had been forced into retirement in 1955 after participating in a military coup. After his release, the man fled from Argentine justice, first to Uruguay and then to Brazil, but returned after several years later. Rodolfo returned to the country. Rodolfo was a truly useful member of the Puccio clan, as he was still able to obtain weapons and had the necessary connections with law enforcement. The second accomplice was 42-year-old Hernando Laberda, a former national intelligence agent, member of the New Argentina movement, and participant in the Peronist resistance. Peronism is a specific political ideology associated with the policies of President Juan Perón. The third man was 44-year-old Roberto Mecca, a mechanic who had landed a job as head of technical maintenance at a local car dealership. Roberto willingly collaborated with the leaders of local gangs who set cars on fire to collect insurance money. The main thing that all of the accomplices had in common was their similar political views and their affiliation with the right wing of the Peronists. However, they now shared another common goal: kidnapping people for ransom. These kidnappings were well thought out and carefully planned. After some time, the name of the first victim emerged. It would be a man named Ricardo Manoukian, a major businessman and owner of a supermarket chain. Manoukian knew Alejandro, Arquimedes' eldest son. They sometimes went boating together and spent time together. Unfortunately, this acquaintance could not protect the businessman from his kidnapping. The man continued his normal life, unaware that he was being followed daily and that his every move was being recorded, whether on his way to the office, home, or to see his lover. The kidnapping took place on Thursday, July 22, 1982. Ricardo got into his car and drove to a family meeting at one of the city's restaurants. Halfway there, his vehicle was blocked by a Ford Falcon. 3 armed men wearing hoods got out of the car. They were Arquimedes, Rodolfo, and Laberta. They quickly opened the car door and dragged him out. Then they tied the man's hands, placed a heavy sack over his head, and took him to the Puccio family's house. At that moment, the kidnapped man's fate was likely sealed. Arquimedes dragged Ricardo up a spiral staircase to the second floor and locked him in a previously prepared bathroom that looked more like a torture chamber from a horror movie. The bathroom walls were papered with newspapers, the ceiling covered with plastic sheeting. Yes, this horrific room became Manoukian's home for the next 11 days. The next day, Arquimedes called Ricardo's family from a public phone and began negotiations. Meanwhile, the hostage was guarded by Alejandro, Arquimedes' eldest son, who knew Ricardo well. The kidnapped man's family demanded proof that Ricardo was still alive. Finally, Arquimedes forced the man to write a letter to his family. In this letter, Manoukian asked his family members to strictly follow the kidnapper's instructions and not to tell the police. Among other things, he wrote that he was fine, receiving water and being fed rice and chicken. Arquimedes wrote this letter in the restroom of a bar. After making sure the family members had read the letter, the criminal contacted them again and demanded a ransom of $250,000. He also gave Manoukian's family members the address where they would receive further instructions for the exchange. The notes with the instructions were contained in empty beer cans, which in turn had been placed in mailboxes. The mailboxes were located in various, carefully selected locations. A few days later, Guillermo Manoukian, Ricardo's brother, followed the instructions and placed a black briefcase containing the money on the steps of San Isidro Cathedral, just a few blocks from the Puccio family home in whose bathroom the captive was. On the same day, the kidnapped man's brother received a call from Arquimedes, who told him that he would meet Ricardo the next day. He wanted to release the kidnapped man tomorrow. However, in the morning, the kidnappers disagreed about releasing the kidnapped man, as Alejandro, who had brought the man food, believed Manoukian recognized him. After receiving the requested sum, the criminals decided to change their original plan and eliminate Ricardo by another means. They stunned the man, carried his body out of the bathroom, and placed it in the trunk of a car. They then drove to a secluded location, opened the trunk, and killed the kidnapped man with 3 shots. The perpetrator was Laberta. It is worth noting that there is also another version, according to which each of the accomplices fired a shot to share the blame for the murder. It was a kind of ritual. Afterward, they threw the victim's body on the ground and placed a typewriter next to it, which they had used to write notes with instructions for the victim's family. Several hours later, Manoukian's relatives were still by the phone, waiting for the criminals' call, the final call in which they would learn that Ricardo had been released. Finally, the phone rang, but on the other end of the line was not Arquimedes' grim voice, but that of a police officer announcing that Ricardo's body had been found on the bank of a stream. Thus, within 11 days, the organized crime group had received a ransom and taken a life. Soon, it was the turn of the next kidnapping victim, a 25-year-old man named Eduardo All. Eduardo was an industrial engineer, had recently married, and had just learned that he had become president of his father's metalworking company. The kidnapping took place on May 5, 1983. Like any other day, All left home and headed for work, but unfortunately, he never arrived at his destination. Eduardo's family searched everywhere for him, but there were no leads. It seemed as if the earth had simply swallowed him. Some time after his disappearance, however, the young man's father received a call from Archimedes, who informed him that Eduardo had been kidnapped and asked him to wait for another call with detailed instructions. The kidnapped man himself, meanwhile, was locked in a small closet in the criminal's office. He had been kidnapped in the same way as Manukian. A few hours later, the kidnapper contacted All's father again, demanding $350,000 and some written proof that Eduardo was still alive. These were letters the young man had written. One, however, was addressed to his father, the other to his wife. In the letters, Eduard emphasized that money can come and go, but life can be over forever. After the last call, several days passed without any payment from the kidnapped man's relatives. Archimedes then lowered the ransom demand to $200,000 and then decided to take a break and cut off contact with the All family completely. For a week, Edward's family received no news of him. They couldn't even find out if the young man was still alive. Finally, the kidnapper contacted them again, but this time he addressed Edward's wife directly and lowered the ransom demand to $100,000. It is worth noting that the conversation between Archimedes and All's wife did not go well from the start. The woman insulted the kidnapper with every sentence she uttered, telling him that she would not rest. Presumably, this happened on the 4th day of the kidnapping. The only thing that is certain is that the criminals took All by car to an open field. There, a mason hired by Archimedes dug a well which later became Edward's grave. As a result of this act, relations between the members of the criminal organization began to deteriorate. This was mainly because Archimedes claimed a much larger share of the ransom, believing he did the bulk of the work. Nevertheless, none of the accomplices dared to seriously confront the man. In June 1984, the Puccio clan had another victim. The victim was a young businessman named Emilio Naum, married to Alice and with 2 daughters. According to the new plan, the perpetrators were to stop Emilio's car, drag him out, and stuff him into the trunk. Then, as before, they were to take the victim to Archimedes' house and begin negotiations. But everything went differently than planned. On the morning of the day of the kidnapping, Archimedes drove his car alongside Emilio's car and tried to block his path. The young man suspected trouble, and the next kidnapping attempt seemed to have failed. A commotion ensued, and the situation spiraled out of control. Eventually, the perpetrators had to shoot Emilio and flee after wiping away any fingerprints on the victim's car with a rag. The failed kidnapping considerably unsettled the accomplices. Fortunately for them, the police investigation made no progress. Although the crime had occurred in the middle of the street, not a single witness could be found. The authorities repeatedly tested the most outlandish hypotheses. At first, they claimed the dead man was a pimp or a courier of illegal substances. Then they suspected it was some kind of settling of scores, and finally, they even claimed that Emilio had been murdered by his own wife. Alicia, the victim's wife, didn't sit idly by and began her own investigation. She soon found a witness who described the entire situation in considerable detail and even specified what the attackers were wearing. According to the woman, one of the attackers was wearing a poorly ironed gray suit. This man was none other than Archimedes. After some time, Emilio's wife received a threatening phone call from the leader of the crime clan. The man informed her that her late husband owed him a large sum of money, which, with interest, amounted to $350,000. Among other things, the man stated that he would kill her daughters if she refused to pay. The perpetrator didn't want to miss the opportunity to get the money. After all, he had planned the kidnapping for a long time and studied his victim closely. Finally, the frightened woman decided to take a different approach. She called a judge friend, who put her in touch with officers from the extortion and fraud unit of the Argentine Federal Police. After consulting with the authorities, the woman, accompanied by police officers, went to the location specified by the criminals and took the agreed-upon sum of money as bait. However, Archimedes failed to show up for the agreed meeting. Presumably, one of the bribed police officers had warned him of a potential trap. Alicia had no choice but to leave the country. The next day, she traveled to Rio de Janeiro with her daughters. She deliberately told almost no one about her trip. During this time, a housekeeper looked after her home. According to the woman, the phone rang on the day Alicia and her children left. When she answered, she heard Brazilian music. The next victim would be Nelida Bolna, a 58-year-old woman who owned several large car dealerships and a funeral home in Argentina. In addition to financial ambitions, the members of the criminal clan had other motives for killing Nelida. Archimedes and his accomplices believed that the woman and her children were doing business with their ideological enemies, namely a man named Eduardo Massera. Massera was a well-known military and statesman and a member of the military junta that effectively ruled Argentina. On July 23, 1985, the gang kidnapped Nelida on the street, placed a sack over her head, stuffed her into a van, and took her directly to the House of Horrors. The woman was the first inmate of the newly constructed cell in the basement of the Puccio family home. Like the bathroom where Ricardo Manukian was held, the walls were papered with newspapers. The basement contained only a small cot, a fan, and a bale of straw. The kidnappers wanted Nelida to believe she was in a village far outside the city. The basement, the room in which the captive was held, was designed so that it could only be entered from the courtyard of the house. Furthermore, this passage was almost constantly blocked with various objects, such as wine bottles and tools, for camouflage purposes. The next day, Archimedes called the kidnapped woman's sons and demanded a ransom of $500,000. The woman's sons immediately contacted the police. Law enforcement soon installed a call tracing device and tapped the phone. Meanwhile, the days passed. Nelida was starving and still in the same damp room. At one point, one of the kidnappers asked her if she liked rice with chicken. She replied, yes. He then poured a handful of raw rice into her hands, placed a chicken bone on top, and then stepped aside, laughing for a long time. Nelida lost count of the days. She didn't know how long she had been held captive, nor did she know whether it was day or night. Sometimes she thought she was already dead. She only used a bucket toilet, which was emptied once a day. Most of the time, she was pumped full of sleeping pills and given almost nothing to eat. Archimedes, on the other hand, continued to call the children of the kidnapped women and demand ransom, ignoring the fact that investigators were monitoring all conversations. This allowed the police to determine that most of the kidnappers' calls came from phones in the same area. After 32 days, the relatives and the kidnappers finally managed to agree on the ransom amount, the date, and the location of the handover. On August 23, 1985, Archimedes, accompanied by his accomplices, arrived at the agreed-upon location to collect the money. The criminals barely managed to get out of the car and take a few steps before they were surrounded by armed police and ordered to lie down on the ground. As he lay on the ground at gunpoint, Archimedes began to improvise, shouting that his house was filled with dynamite and that if the police entered, there would inevitably be an explosion. However, the man's threats came too late, because at almost the same time, a group of 45 police officers entered his house. During the search of the house, the remaining members of the gang were arrested, including Alejandro, who had just been watching a movie with his girlfriend. Later, the kidnapped woman was found, still in a specially equipped room in the basement. During the search of the Puccio family's home, their neighbors gathered. They could not believe that such gruesome, brutal crimes had been secretly committed in the home of an ordinary, wealthy family. A few hours later, a search of the family patriarch's office yielded 2 submachine guns, a rifle with a telescopic sight, several radios, 4 masks, a book titled Kidnapper's Manual, and a notebook with the names of future victims. This revealed that the clan had planned at least 10 more kidnappings. A cross was already placed next to the name of the next alleged victim, a businessman who worked in the fishing industry. However, the next crime could not be committed because the Puccio clan had been dismantled. At the police station, Alejandro Puccio stated that he knew nothing, and above all, that he had not participated in his father's schemes. He claimed that the perpetrators had tortured him to force him to take responsibility for some of the crimes. Numerous friends of the young man came to his aid and confirmed his statement to the media. They repeatedly stated that Alejandro was perhaps the kindest and most gracious person in the entire state. According to the interviewees, he may indeed have been unaware that various people were being held against their will in his parents' house for an extended period. Archimedes was rather reserved in his comments to the authorities and the press. He simply repeated the same sentence, "I have nothing to say, I have nothing to do with the kidnapping of people." At the same time, media representatives received comments from relatives of the kidnapped victims. Betty, the wife of the murdered Emilio Naum, complained that members of the horrific Puccio family had first taken her husband's life and then extorted money from her, which is why she had to temporarily leave the country. Guillermo Manuchian, Ricardo's brother, expressed his conviction that these very individuals, members of the criminal clan, were involved in his brother's kidnapping and brutal murder. The man said that if the criminals were released one way or another, they would certainly kill someone again. Archimedes's wife Epiphania and their daughter Yudi were initially arrested but later released due to insufficient evidence against them. Hernando's Loboda, Rodolfo Franco, and Roberto Diaz, who were directly linked to the kidnappings, decided almost immediately to confess and were later sentenced to life imprisonment. A few days after their arrest, authorities led them to the site where Eduardo had been buried. The bricklayer who had built the well, which later became the grave, was also arrested. This man tried to justify his actions by claiming that he had built the well for other purposes. The authorities did not believe him. Later, Fernandez Laborda stated that he regretted not having killed Archimedes. The man said he had his own truth, but that it remained with him. Apart from this statement and his original confession, he said nothing more. In 2020, he suffered a stroke, lost his ability to speak, and died in complete solitude under constant guard. One of the lawyers representing Laborda was Alberto Fernandez, none other than the incumbent president of Argentina. Alejandro Puccio, son and right-hand man of his father Archimedes Puccio, was finally sentenced to life imprisonment in 1985. Alejandro later married a woman who had written him letters in prison for a long time. He died in 2008 at the consequences of pneumonia. Archimedes Puccio was also sentenced to life imprisonment in 1985. During his time in prison, he managed the prison library, learned a new profession, and became a lawyer. In 2008, after 23 years in prison, the man was released early. After his release, he became engaged to his first client, a 48-year-old woman named Rosiala. He died at the age of 84 from the effects of a stroke in the home of a Protestant priest friend in General Pico, without ever confessing to his crimes. Archimedes's body lay in the municipal morgue for a full week, but no one took care of his funeral. The police contacted his niece to arrange the memorial service and subsequent burial, but she firmly refused. The woman took only the deceased's few belongings, including books, magazines, and manuscripts. Archimedes's clothes and cell phone were buried with his body in the cemetery in General Puccio, was buried in a neighborhood that local gravediggers call the place of the forgotten. The graves in this cemetery were all the same, differing only by the inscriptions on the headstones. Essentially, it was one large communal grave. No one came to the funeral of the former leader of the crime clan. When the man called his ex-wife Epiphania for the last time, she told him she wished him a quick death. A few days after this call, Archimedes learned that his daughter, Sylvia, had died of cancer. He had also tried to reconcile with her, but she said she wanted to change her cell phone number so he could no longer call her. Archimedes' ex-wife Epiphania is currently 91 years old. The woman continues to use the surname Puccio. The Argentine justice system has never been able to prove her involvement in the kidnappings. Adriana, the youngest daughter of Epiphania and Archimedes, was 15 years old at the time of the events. It is reasonable to assume that the girl could not have overlooked what was going on in her parents' home. She currently sells boats. Almost nothing is known about Guillermo Puccio. He fled to Australia as soon as he suspected that his father and brother were planning something strange and illegal. According to available information, he did not return to his country until 2020. Daniel Puccio was arrested by Brazilian authorities in September 2019 for using forged documents. In 2015, Argentine director Pablo Trapero made the film El Clan, based on the criminal history of the Puccio family. This film became the most successful film of the year in Argentina. The story of the Puccio clan is another chapter that reflects a dark and violent period in Argentina's history. Thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.